Luke Yates es profesor de sociología e investigador en el Instituto de Consumo Sostenible de la Universidad de Manchester, Reino Unido. Sus líneas de investigación y trabajo se enfocan en los movimientos sociales, las nuevas tecnologías y las teorías del consumo. Algunas de sus publicaciones más relevantes son La importancia de la vida cotidiana, política cotidiana, consumo cotidiano y cambio social, y cómo las plataformas digitales movilizan a sus usuarios y aliados, el lobby corporativo de base y el movimiento de Airbnb por la desregulación. Su libro más reciente es La política de las plataformas, poder corporativo, movimientos de base y economía colaborativa. Una obra que analiza las estrategias políticas de las plataformas tecnológicas y las acciones ciudadanas de resistencia a las mismas. Las investigaciones de Yates han sido traducidas al alemán y al español y ha sido entrevistado por el Financial Times y la BBC.
Pues aquí estamos con Luke Yates, un gran lujo, un honor recibirlo aquí en la UNAM, y aquí estamos en la Casa Universitaria del Libro. Gracias a Guadalupe Alonso, a pues, toda la difusión cultural de la UNAM por recibirnos en este lugar tan hermoso. Ya es la segunda entrevista que hemos hecho aquí. Y welcome, Luke. We'll do the interview in English. I know you know Spanish, but we can talk in English. And if you want to interject some phrases in Spanish, that's fine too. But I want to hear from you all of your thoughts that you're coming to share here. You have a new book about the need to regulate platforms. This is something very important for us here in Mexico because we are in the law of the jungle. No, there's no laws really to regulate any of the platforms in Mexico, from Facebook, WhatsApp, Uber, Airbnb. We're just starting to get some of the first regulations, right? Mexico City has started to put some controls on rent and gentrification in Mexico City. Uber drivers are starting to get some rights in terms of as to their labor rights, but in general, we have a real emptiness there, vacío, in terms of the regulation. Why is it important to have rule of law in this area of the platforms?
So the issue is that platforms arrived about 10, 15 years ago and sort of landed on cities without really a kind of discussion about what they were for, what kind of effects they would produce, and without consultation with any city governments or the people, really. They arrived without us asking for them. And that created a series of problems. They scaled up very rapidly, and we began to see effects on the intensification of precarious work, issues around safety in the taxis, in the ride-hailing platforms, but also in Airbnbs, where a number of sort of crises or disasters happened, where people would the lack of safety regulations around. If you stay in an Airbnb, you haven't got the same protection that a hotel has. So we started to see these issues kind of surface. And then with Airbnb, the big one was housing. We started to see entire streets in some of the major cities in the world, particularly tourist centres, being eaten up by the platform. So it took a few years for us to realise what was happening with the platforms, partly because of a complete lack of access to the data that we need to understand what the kind of numbers behind these phenomena. So gradually, as we've sort of learned what's happening, particularly issues around housing with relation to Airbnb and the intensification of that precarious work that you see with Uber, Lyft, the meal delivery platforms, governments are sort of finally realizing that something needs to be done because the opportunities are starting to be outweighed by some of the costs and some of the problems with those platforms.
In the beginning, these platforms were supposed to liberate the economy, right? Allow us to get around these big monopolies and this centralized control over the economy, either in the private or the public sector. This was going to be a network economy, which allowed us to empower the citizens to buy and sell in the marketplace. And this dream has not come true, really, right?
Right. So the narratives around the emergence of this new economy were very morally inflected. They were very persuasive discourses around sharing and collaboration, and this, emerged in a period of disenchantment with the prevailing economic status quo across the world, a dissatisfaction with neoliberalism having created all these problems around the financial crisis. And so these platforms initially presented themselves as a kind of answer to neoliberalism and to corporate capitalism. They were against the big hotels. They were against big taxi, as it was called. And somehow, using this kind of narrative of community, of sharing, of hospitality, of entrepreneurship, they were able to create an image of a different kind of economy. What we've seen in the last few years is that increasingly that sort of idea of sharing, collaboration, entrepreneurship, it is not really ringing true for either the people who are working in that economy, nor the governments that have to regulate it, nor the people who have to live alongside large numbers of Airbnbs in cities where it's swallowing up tens of thousands of homes that could otherwise be long-term residences for people. So there's been a kind of wave of disenchantment, and I think there has been with technology and the technology sector per se. In the last 10 years, the conversation's completely changed, hasn't it, around how we understand kind of the digital economy. And so how can you talk about a sharing economy when the vast majority of listings on a platform like Airbnb and other short-term rental platforms are commercial listings? They are not a room in somebody's house. They are an entire apartment or even a detached house that is not perhaps even used all year round. It might be the odd weekend, and otherwise it's lying empty. So the sharing that's going on, it starts to not really make any sense any longer. That sense of collaboration, sharing, entrepreneurship. Again, but the entrepreneurship, if you look at the lives of Uber drivers, they're becoming more and more precarious. Initially, it seemed to make sense. It seemed to be a lucrative way of getting by. It seemed to offer new economic opportunities. What's happened with Uber is, particularly in the last couple of years, pay has completely flatlined, and particularly with the use of algorithmic pricing, drivers don't know what they're going to get for a trip, and the relationship between what a customer's paying and what a driver's being paid, that relationship no longer has any transparency to it. So it's that narrative, the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, is sort of dissolving in front of our eyes, and so it's a kind of moment of, I think, coming to terms with what it really is then.
Sorry We Missed You is one of the movies that, to me, sort of leave everything quite clear about how this works. This is probably old news for you guys from England, no? How was it, like 10 years ago, Ken launched this movie? Or
yeah, something like that. I want to say 5 to 10 years ago.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
It's sort of so poetically and clearly put the issues on the table. I don't know, maybe you didn't like it, but to me it was a very clear consciousness-raising movie, as many of Ken Loach's movies, revealing the lies behind this sort of idea of the self-entrepreneur, of freedom through contracting yourself, through the Uber, the platform economy. Is this something that has totally taken over the British economy? We'll get to Mexico in particular. I want to get your advice and thoughts about it. But in Britain, has this like totally gone overboard now, or is it still sort of a minority part of the economy that you're trying to control?
No, so it's become a pretty major part of the economy in most of the cities. So I suppose, ride-hailing platforms and the meal delivery platforms like DoorDash, Deliveroo, Uber Eats. They're more located in the urban kind of centres, so the big cities. Airbnb is a problem both in the cities and in rural areas. So there's estimates that kind of between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 properties in Cornwall, for example, are Airbnbs, which makes it very, very difficult for people who are born and raised in that area to actually to remain in place. And that problem of the expulsion of local residents, the gentrification of people from the area where they might want to live, is one of the major issues associated with Airbnb. And it's a problem in the city that I'm from, Manchester, where we put out a public report in 2021. Even in the height of the pandemic, we could see properties in poor ethnic minority neighbourhood, Moss Side, being increasingly landlords buying up those properties and turning them into Airbnb properties, which might not seem like an issue, but they were turning every room into a bedroom, such that you might have 15, 20 people staying in one of these properties in a night. And these were party houses. They were often and happening sometimes in the middle of lockdowns during the pandemic. So it was a really shocking experience for those neighbours to be next door and having to try and sleep through
like having a frat house next door to you, right?
Yeah. So there's the lack of predictability, which I think is very difficult. So if you're having to live next door to, or even a couple of doors down, it has impacts on your well-being. And so we've seen in the cities and in the kind of rural areas of the UK, the platform economy's kind of taken hold and started to sort of transform, I suppose, our experience of our own neighbourhoods, but also of work. And I think we're still in a kind of moment of, I think, coming to terms with those changes in the UK. So we've largely had governments which, particularly in the years that the platform economy has sort of started to manifest, it's been very much a neoliberal consensus, which is low regulation, which is growth of businesses, the production of new jobs, no matter what the quality of those jobs is always a good thing. I think what we're starting to see is that the relationship between that production of new opportunities and the lives of people who exist in those neighborhoods or in the industries which are being destroyed by the gig economy really matter too. So it's thinking about not just the people who've got these new opportunities, but also who's affected by them. What are the downstream implications of platforms?
Technology in general, when we talk about the artificial intelligence too, is just on steroids in terms of its quest to suck out as much of our lives and productivity as possible without giving anything back. Like you're saying, the Uber drivers no longer know really why they're getting how much at a different moment. It's up to the algorithm to decide, and always, of course, this algorithm is going to be skewed in the interest of Uber, of the corporation, right? And these drivers have very little actual power to organize or to defend their rights. Of course, they can always just exit, right? And go and work for a different platform. But the whole way in which this economy is structured not only affects our lives, but affects what we can actually do in terms of political action, right? It was much easier with a union that's what Marx said, right? We're together on the factory floor, realizing our collective power to create goods for the capitalist. Let's use that same collective power to empower ourselves. And we no longer have that space for organizing, right?
Yeah, I have a few reservations with that because we are seeing the organizing of drivers and couriers in relation to meal delivery platforms. And
in England, are there experiences of that? Tell us about that.
Yeah, in England and Europe, and I think in North America too. So I think, again, we're in a kind of moment where we're working out how to organize in relation to these kinds of platforms. So it's tricky to organize couriers and drivers because they're keeping strange hours a lot of the time to keep up with the demand of when people want food brought to them and when they want rides. It's an economy which is it's happening constantly. So that creates problems. You haven't got the same moments where you can meet a co-worker and organize with them. But there are other kind of opportunities which are thrown up by the particularities of these businesses. So if you take something like DoorDash or Deliveroo, a meal delivery platform, there's certain restaurants which are very popular. So the McDonald's is the place in the north of the UK where you'll see the drivers. They'll be hanging out and they'll be hanging out and chatting, and they'll be in car parks. And what we've seen in the last few years in the biggest strikes against meal delivery companies have come out of these informal points of interaction. And they've been increasingly focused on the restaurants that are providing the food. So it's quite difficult to target a technology platform. Often there isn't a headquarters in the city or sometimes even the country where they are operating from. So you need to look for other opportunities and points of leverage. So what couriers have done in the north of England in particular is, rather than going on strike fully, which obviously has serious consequences for your pay in a very short term, it starts to catch up with you quickly. They've been running strikes targeted or boycotts targeting particular businesses. And what that does is it leverages the relationship that business has with the platform and is a bit more sustainable longer term. So you can keep going for longer by using that kind of tactic. So we're starting to see the emergence of new organizing tactics in the platform economy. Similar with tenants' unions.
Interrupt you 1 second.
Go ahead.
We got to go to a quick commercial public television break, and we'll be right back. I want to keep hearing about these experiences. That sounds inspiring. We'll be right back with Luke Yates. En 2 minutitos regresamos. Aquí seguimos con Luke Yates. Actually, Luke Yates has confessed to me that he is a poet, right?
I am. Yeah.
Are you related to the classic Yates? No
relation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What kind of poetry do you write?
Influenced by New York school poets from the 60s, 70s, but with a bit of a kind of northern British twist on that, if that makes sense.
A name of a book, a poetry book that you've published, so we can look it up?
Yeah, Dynamo came out a couple of years ago with Smith Dorstop Press, based in Sheffield. Yeah.
Wonderful. Were you first a poet or first a sociologist?
Probably first a poet. Yeah, but they're closer than you might think.
Tell me about that. What's the relation between sociology and poetry?
They're both kind of forms of observation, I guess, or they sit on looking at and thinking about the world in I guess trying to see things from new angles. So I guess both in the poems and in the research, I'm trying to provide like a new way of understanding something, or trying to experiment with a way of talking and thinking, writing, and seeing that sort of opens up things for my readers, I guess.
Creative interpretation, good. So we were talking about organizing of employees or of users of these platforms. An inspiring example, you were talking about these strikes, we call them. I guess they're not like the classic strikes, but they're strikes against the restaurants in particular. And these strikes are resolved when the restaurants give them like an extra tip for their services, or I imagine they're demanding better working conditions. But if it's not against the platform, then how does it turn out in the end?
Yeah, so it's more like the restaurants are acting as a kind of intermediary between the platform and the courier. So if you're a courier, if you're picking up deliveries from all the different restaurants in town, you don't have a way of communicating back to the platform, and you don't have a way of I guess, letting them know that you're dissatisfied with their declining rates of pay. So similar to what I was saying about ride-hailing platforms, we're seeing the decreasing of pay per drop in meal delivery platforms as well. So to target a particular restaurant is to try and exploit that leverage that restaurant has, constituting perhaps 25% of the orders for Uber Eats in one night, maybe. So far, it's probably safe to say there haven't been huge successes. I think it's still in the process of working out the best way to organize against platforms. With ride-hailing platforms, it's been a little bit different. So approaches to trying to get minimum wage pay, which you would think would be basic and a given, have been persistently thwarted by the idea that if you work for a platform, you're somehow an independent contractor, and you're not subject to the usual regulations of a city or a country.
You're doing it on your free time, right?
Yeah, it's
not a real job, right?
Which is what they used to say to women when they were getting jobs in the 60s in the UK, and when they went on strike, they were saying no, that we actually rely on this money to live. Treat us as professionals, treat us as real workers. And we had the news that the Supreme Court ruled drivers as employees, which meant that they were subject to some of the same protections that workers are entitled to. The problem is that the way that's been interpreted so far is that those hours only apply when a driver is physically in the cabin. So an increasing proportion of time, if you're an Uber driver or a Lyft driver, is spent hanging around, waiting for the next job. And the numbers of drivers are just increasing. I was in Toronto before, a couple of stops before being here in Mexico City. And we had a discussion with a ride-hailing platform driver, Erla Phillips, who's working in Toronto. And the story that she told was that Toronto a few years ago only had 15,000 taxi drivers. Now there's 100,000 Uber drivers and taxi drivers too. So if you demand for taxis and private transportation in Toronto has not increased that much, which means that it's increasingly difficult for you to just make ends meet. You're waiting for these jobs and you're not being paid when you're waiting for those jobs.
If there is so much demand for transportation, it should be relatively easy for a nonprofit, citizen-run network to arise and to compete with these platforms. I mean, it's not like the technology behind these platforms is hyper sophisticated. I mean, you got to have constant maintenance. I mean, it's not easy. It's not, but it's not like this. It's rocket science. I mean, a group of innovative citizens with some tech savvy could actually develop an alternative platform which could be profitable and just sort of cut out this abuse by these platforms, right?
It's absolutely possible, and we've seen experiments, prototypes of those kinds of platforms emerge in cities all over the world. The problem is that they're faced with competition from a platform which is willing to undercut those new services until they are eliminated. So because platforms come with seemingly unlimited reserves of venture capital, they're able to unsustainably subsidize fares and deliveries until the point that they hold monopoly status. And that creates a problem for a worker-owned or co-op version of Uber or Lyft. So we need regulation in order for an alternative platform, exactly as you say, to emerge and to be viable. And it's happened in moments, but we haven't seen anything fully materialize, which has I guess pushed Uber out of a particular town. So I think that's the next step, but it needs some support. It needs our support. It needs governmental support. And I think that needs to come from the recognition that the platforms aren't delivering for the people anymore.
So the government needs to step in. It's not enough for autonomous citizen worker organization because of this unequal playing field. I mean, so they can just drop like, what Trump accuses China of, dumping or, reducing prices to control. These big corporations do exactly that, right? To control the markets through an abuse of power. So if the government steps in, the liberals, neoliberals are going to scream that this means censorship, this means communism. How can the government intervene so that it actually permits society to flourish, right? And we don't create a state-run platform. Maybe that's the only solution, a state-run platform. But how have you negotiated that? Is that a debate that's happening today in the United Kingdom?
I mean, I think it is a debate. It's always a debate in neoliberalism how to frame the need for regulation. But you can see this another way as well. So the platforms that are operating as near monopolies at the moment, that doesn't really fulfill the kind of the dream of most kind of neoliberal economists and governments. So even in the interests of opening up competition to the existing platforms, there should be regulation to make sure that even just that the market works. And that's the most basic form of regulation that we're talking about, but that would provide opportunities for community-run platforms, not necessarily state-run platforms, to start to operate. And I do think we need to kind of imagine what role the state could play in, I suppose, establishing the conditions for a community that's able to relate to technology in a way that doesn't undermine their working conditions, that doesn't undermine their quality of life, the quality of sleep their children are having if they're living on the same street as an Airbnb. So it's a kind of question of getting the right balance, isn't it, with regulation? And I suppose I think we're not necessarily talking about a kind of a state-run platform. We're talking about platforms which are able to be run in the interests of the people who use them, work for them, and use them as customers.
Right, but it's important to clarify that you're saying that we do need the state to actually be involved, because otherwise we're not going to have that possibility. They'll just aplastar, I'm thinking in Spanish, squash the competition, right?
Or you need extremely strong social movements and unions, and that's that's another route, but it's slower. And normally the way these things work is I guess multifaceted.
Beyond England, what are the most interesting, perhaps not success stories, but achievements of social movements or the defense of labor and human rights in this sphere of the platform economy? I don't know, other experiences in Latin America, India, Europe.
Yeah, I mean the housing movement in Barcelona in the last few years, and I guess the movements which are critiquing over tourism in a city that's a relatively small city, very, very small city centre, where numbers of tourists have just exponentially increased since they held the Olympics there in '92, I think it was. And in Barcelona, they've had a pretty open debate about the future of the city. How can, in a city that is increasingly dependent on tourism, can we prioritize the needs of residents and workers in those cities? And to have that conversation is not to say no tourists, it's to say how do we make sure that people are able to still live here and continue to make this place the destination that it is. If you increase tourism to the point where and a particular kind of tourism to the point where the particular offer, the food, the culture, and so on is completely eliminated by the presence of so many tourists, then you no longer have tourists. You don't have
anything to see anymore, right?
Yeah, so it's about kind of sustainable approach to thinking about housing and tourism. And what's happened in Barcelona is we had a kind of freeze on hotel licenses and then a freeze on the permits that were being offered for entire home Airbnbs. And now they're talking about eliminating those permits. So in the next 4 years, as a city saying, actually, we might have enough accommodation with hotels, and hotels are, in a way, a pretty innovative thing. People who are visiting a city are together, and they share an interest in the kinds of ways that they want to be in the city.
Well, the classic hotel, right? The French word is when the nobles from the countryside came in and had there's the place where they could stay while they're in Paris, as they're doing their business and their shopping and political activities, and then that. Or restaurants, were also sort of a noble kind of space. And then it became popularized in 19th, 20th century. And so now hotels are for anybody who can pay, of course, or restaurants is for anybody who can pay. And so, originally they're kind of spaces for democratizing tourism. And this is just taking the next step, but we're going too far now. So if I understand you right, Barcelona is considering prohibiting Airbnbs?
Yeah, that's right. Prohibiting not all Airbnbs, but prohibiting the Airbnbs which are commercial listings. So entire homes.
How do they distinguish that?
So entire homes which are dedicated to
So you have to prove
visitors.
that in order to be able to be on Airbnb, you have to prove that this is actually your home and that you're just renting it out for that period in which you're traveling somewhere else. That's what
exactly,
the law says.
Or you might have a spare room or something similar. So the vision of the sharing economy, as it applied to short-term rentals, was that I might not be living in my primary residence all year round, or I might have a spare room which I wouldn't perhaps want somebody to be in there all the time. So perhaps from time to time I'd have a visitor there who I would perhaps show the city to. We're not talking about regulating that out of existence. I don't think many cities are averse to that kind of short-term rental. What most cities have a problem with is the elimination of housing that could otherwise be used for long-term residence by a platform which is telling a story about itself, which is completely inaccurate.
Here in Mexico City, we have a increasing problem with gentrification, with Airbnb. Here, we're in the Colonia Roma, which is sort of ground zero for the process of gentrification here in Mexico City. We're starting to see protests. Like I said, the Mexico City government has started to put some regulation, but we're starting to go through this process in an early stage, perhaps compared to a place like London or Paris. What kind of concrete recommendation would you make for this kind of situation like in Mexico City?
So, if we're talking about Airbnb, we need to be kind of talking about a process of establishing licenses or permits for hosting. So it needs to be regularized in a way that the government is able to monitor the numbers and establish kind of where these Airbnbs are located, and providing the government with the data. So successful ways of regulating Airbnb have tended to emphasize this, that actually you are legally obliged to give us data on who is staying where in the city in Airbnbs.
And does the platform normally obey these governmental requests? I mean, do they actually give the information over, or have they been resistant?
They've been pretty resistant so far. So despite repeatedly saying we want to be regulated, that seemed to be pretty disingenuous, in the sense that when regulations have come in that Airbnb doesn't like, that affect the revenue, particularly of these commercial these commercial rentals, they've been responding with a range of different tactics, and those tactics include all the kind of classic corporate political activity tactics that we know from, I suppose, from private lobbying to lawsuits, to donations to particular politicians who are sympathetic to the platform. But my book is also sort of focusing on a particularly kind of a newish form of tactic that platforms have been developing in the last few years that we're more familiar with from the food and drink, the fossil fuel, the pharmaceutical and the tobacco industry, which is the mobilization of their users and their allies, their grassroots allies particularly. The mobilization in ways which appear to be grassroots, independent mobilizations which support the platform in its bid to stay unregulated.
It's a fascinating concept. I think it's one of the particular additions you're making to the literature in terms of studying this corporate grassroots activism. We're going to go for a second commercial break, un segundo corte. Ahorita regresamos para continuar con este diálogo fascinante con Luke Yates. Sobre la economía de plataformas, sobre los derechos humanos, los movimientos sociales y sobre esto que estamos comentando sobre la movilización ciudadana, pero desde las corporaciones. No se vayan, ahorita regresamos en 2 minutos. Aquí continuamos con Luke Yates. Muchas gracias a nuestra audiencia. Gracias, Luke, por este tiempo. So you're here in Mexico City to give a series of talks. Right?
That's
You're
right.
at the UNAM, at the UACM, no? La Universidad Autónoma de la Ciudad de México, presenting your book. Is your first time in Mexico? Or?
It is, yeah. Excited to be here. It's an amazing city. I know that already, but even the kind of 24 hours I've been here, pretty exciting. Yeah.
Mexico City has suddenly gotten really cool, actually. Almost too cool.
Right.
Linked to the gentrification thing, we got these spring breakers coming down now. But it is actually a wonderful city, and it's still livable, right? That's why it's so important for us to learn from you and from cities like you're from Manchester, but bigger. And how many people live in Manchester?
It's about 400,000 in principle,
size.
but then there's the greater Manchester area. Depends where you draw the boundaries. 2.5 million, depending on how you count them.
Small city compared to Mexico City, but still very important experiences so that we can see what we know is already happening, but what could happen in just a few years if we don't open our eyes and really pay attention. So one particular proposal you're putting on the table is this transparency, that these platforms need to hand over their information to the government so the government can actually supervise and oversee the functioning of the economy. Like you're saying, this is not like a revolutionary idea, but it's very basic. What other kinds of actions can we take either as government or as civil society to start putting limits on this process and to save this wonderful Mexico City that we're living in today?
Yeah, so I think exactly as you asked, like we need to kind of always be looking how are they doing it elsewhere. So New York City's in the kind of process of I suppose celebrating their 2nd anniversary of some regulation that came in a couple of years ago on which seemingly has cut, I think, numbers of listings by 11,000 somewhere in that region. New York City is a city that has had a protracted housing crisis, so it's extremely important there that they get it right. So there's kind of models from New York City, from San Francisco, Barcelona that I mentioned already, Berlin, Amsterdam, where you can see different arrangements, licensing systems, limits on nights per year that a listing can be on the platform. Permits where you have to sort of apply to turn your home into a kind of a hotel, just as you would with any other business. So there's a range of different cities that we can kind of take inspiration from when we're doing that. And I think also we can look at those cities in terms of what's happened politically, what have been the challenges to bringing in regulation in those cities. One of them being this kind of the mobilization of platform users, which has kind of been a really puzzling thing for governments to kind of to work out, and for the media and the public to sort of understand.
Tell me more about that. This sounds like a fascinating phenomenon. What are these corporations doing to mobilize their bases of support?
Yeah,
right?
so we talked a bit about the the increasingly sort of powerful social movements that are opposing platforms, from anti-gentrification movements and housing movements to trade unions or other kind of worker initiatives in the gig economy. But these are kind of movements almost pointing in the opposite direction. They appear to be movements which are independent of the platform, but which are advocating on behalf of the platform. And so the research that I did was based on a case study of the global strategy of Airbnb to remain unregulated by mobilizing their hosts usually in host groups, but also through email campaigns, protests, one-on-one meetings with politicians. And for a long time, this sort of started happening in around 2014, around that time, where there were big debates and big struggles happening in San Francisco, New York, and Barcelona in particular. And people didn't know what to make of them. Where have these people come from? These hosts who have incredibly compelling personal stories. And what was striking was that all these hosts were home sharers. They all just had a story where they would give a testimony, and they just had a spare room, or they were out of town for a month or two per year, and they were reliant on that income to do something terribly important for society. They were artists, or they were looking after a long-term ill kind of member of the family. But journalists started to kind of dig around, and they sort of thought that actually all is not as it seems with these home sharing clubs. And one of the things that I did in the book was interview a number of ex-Airbnb employees who'd worked in this area of mobilization, as they called it. So they worked in public policy, and they held often the role community organizer, which is a term that we're familiar with from organizing neighborhoods from the 1920s, 1930s onwards in the United States. But interestingly, these community organizers had a background working actually in the Democrat Party in North America, in the United States. They'd at first come from the Obama organizing campaigns.
They had actually done grassroots political organizing from a left perspective.
They had, but a very professionalized and kind of and target orientated perspective. And Airbnb had seen that and thought we could do that in our business. So they hired hundreds of community organizers worldwide. So this was happening in, the people that I spoke to worked in Europe, North America, Mexico as well. They talked about the tactics that they used to select the right kind of landlords, because they had to find people who were the original home sharers. They had to find this face of the platform, irrespective of how unrepresentative it is. And then they had to kind of support them. They had to turn them into political activists. And a lot of these people didn't know what to say at first. So the process of training them, rehearsing the stories, the testimonies, editing those stories and testimonies was incredibly intensive. So I spoke to these.
And what did they get out of it? The home share, did they give them extra benefits on the platform for participating in this advertising campaign? Or?
No, I suppose their interest was a platform, being able to continue to host on a platform which was relatively lucrative for them. So, but it's a good question, because there was actually a lot of work that went into persuading them to participate in this way and to reduce the costs by all means possible. So community organizers, the Airbnb staff, would pay for these hosts' travel. They would pay to bus them to Albany, to state capitol, to protest a particular law that was potentially coming in. They would put on food. They would put on meetings which were held in sort of glamorous locations and so on. So there's a real process of trying to kind of persuade, also establish a relationship of trust, even friendship with those hosts. And the process of trying to find those people, turn them into the right kind of activist is incredibly intensive and I think quite expensive.
This is so perverse, of course, but I always like to see the silver lining. It's fascinating that even a corporation like Airbnb, or I don't know if it also applies to Uber, etc., needs to legitimate itself by using the grammar and the way of organizing of the left. That in the end, in the long term, makes me feel optimistic that in the end, the real way to get legitimacy is through that kind of movement politics. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Does this actually work? I mean, were they?
It's been effective in a number of cities. So it's always hard to know kind of what one particular tactic, what the impact is when they're doing everything else as well. Yeah, I think all the ex-Airbnb staff that I spoke to had stories about the kind of the palpable effect of a couple of hundred, in some cases in the big cities, hosts packing out a courtroom and one by one going up and telling these incredible stories, these testimonies, which were sort of obviously curated, or I mean, obviously for some onlookers, but for others it was just kind of it was just a sense of this is peculiar.
And they're real stories.
They're real stories, and it's difficult to be face to face with somebody who has this kind of background and say, well, we're going to regulate this platform such that you cannot do that anymore. But what was obvious was that these were incredibly unrepresentative faces to the kind of the business as it stood.
These corporations that run Airbnb, are they just hotel? I mean, is it like Sheraton and Hilton who have just gotten into the Airbnb business, buying up buildings and tourist areas, or are these who are these people who are like who are behind the scenes, are actually getting? Because I assume that they're getting, or maybe it's actually the platform itself. I mean, between the owners and the platform, who's winning more, and what's the political economy in that situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the landlords, the typical Airbnb landlord, there almost isn't a kind of a typical one, but I think that it's somebody who owns a few properties and is sort of doing it in a semi sort of amateurish way, but they've started to make quite a lot of money from it. So they might be expanding, but there's also large companies who control a sort of a number of listings too, and you still have this probably about 8% of it's been estimated kind of globally who have just a spare room. The revenue, the proportion of revenue which comes to Airbnb vastly more disproportionately from commercial listings. We know from the kind of the data that we have, the sort of city by city data that we have. So the political economy of it, we're still sort of working out the relationship between a kind of the local economy, investors who are often buying up kind of entire kind of blocks of flats in cities, with the idea that these might be used for the visitor economy, with the idea that as we currently have a largely unregulated short-term rental sector, this pushes up the potential profitability of these spaces, and of course pushes up rent in those cities.
We have a few minutes left. Let's shift a little bit of the conversation to talk about citizens in general. Another thing that our subjectivities, the way in which we're living post-modernity, or no, I don't know how to call it anymore, 21st century platform life, because another thing you talked about in your research, that this is just changing how we understand the world and understand politics and each other. This sort of platform existence. What are the particular challenges that you're seeing in that area?
So going back to the kind of the point around this kind of astroturfing or this corporate grassroots activism, what it does is it starts to kind of distort what our sense of citizenship is, what our sense of democracy is, and what kind of public participation looks like. The risk is that it undermines trust in grassroots politics. You're right that in a sense the use of these tactics does kind of vindicate us. It gives us a sense that, well, they are using these tactics usually actually to neutralize successful housing movements or unions, and this is a tactic used across the platform economy. In a sense, it's globalizing astroturfing. We know that it's been used in tobacco fossil fuel, pharmaceutical, food and drink industry. But it's not till the platform economy arrived really that these tactics started to become globalized and started to be used across the world beyond kind of North America. So it is testament to the power of grassroots movements. It's also testament to how far we've come in the last 15 years, because these tactics are used to try and neutralize a challenge. So they are defensive, in a sense, tactics. Even while the platform economy continues to grow, we can see that these challenges are taking on kind of more and more kind of coherent forms in the cities that we're living in. And I know in Mexico City, the housing movement's been, it started to really take shape in the last kind of year or so. So I think what we're seeing is perhaps a kind of level of the diversification of these tactics signals that we're coming to the end of the line with the narrative of the sharing economy, the collaborative economy. We understand much better than we used to the way that tech works, the way it kind of lands on us without us having asked for it. And the same thing's happening with AI at the moment. WhatsApp's offering me relationship advice and to tell me jokes through its AI feature. So we now know a lot more about how platforms work, about how the digital economy is working. My hope is that we can kind of use that knowledge to sort of face the next wave of platforms or technologies in a way which is kind of where we're readier, I suppose, for those challenges.
AI is going to make it more difficult, right? I mean, this is just sort of superpowering these algorithms and the strategies of these corporations to not lose control over what's going on in the digital sphere, right?
Yeah, there's implications for those democratic processes, like exactly as you say. So if you can already generate kind of large numbers of Airbnb hosts who protest a particular idea or regulation, you can also generate fictitious supporters of platforms to be sort of supporting, bombarding politicians with messages that perhaps don't really ever belong to anybody's one story. So there are implications of the kind of current kind of wave of AI moving into kind of every area of our lives that I think we need to think about at the level of politics, democracy, and kind of how sort of collectively we maintain societies that are livable and where we kind of, in a sense, control or are able to condition and shape the cities and homes that we live in.
Is there any techno optimism left? One of the key examples you shared about organizing was physical Uber drivers or delivery drivers hanging out in the parking lot of McDonald's and organizing. We have to go back to the basics, right? Or can we? Is there still sort of this technological activism that can help us liberate ourselves from the situation?
Yeah, I mean, technology is neutral, right? So it can be used in ways which are beneficial and ways that are problematic for societies. I mean, the era of e-petitions and so on did, in a sense, enable us to communicate and share information at a kind of level that was different. I think you're right, though, that in a way, face-to-face traditional modes of organizing remain pretty effective. And I know from talking to policymakers that, like meeting somebody and speaking to a real person remains a pretty effective way of doing, understanding the concerns and the needs of the kind of population that you're serving. I'm not a techno-optimist, but I also think we need to remember that technology is not inevitable, or the particular things that the CEOs of technology companies say is the future is not the future. It's not necessarily progress. What will happen is, as has always happened, there'll be a relationship, there'll be a negotiation between societies and new technology, where we kind of have to figure out a way of living alongside it and living with it.
Well, thank you so much, Luke, for being with us today.
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a ti,
todos.
Gracias a nuestro muy amable público, gracias a Guadalupe Alonso, a la Casa Universitaria del Libro por esta sede hermosa, y nos vemos de nuevo en 8 días aquí en los Diálogos por la Democracia, aquí en TV UNAM. Te esperamos.